Well, hi, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Mark Raven. Our guest today is Joshua Kerievsky. He's the founder and CEO of a company called Industrial Logic. They are one of the oldest and most well-respected Agile consultancies on the planet. So since 1996, Joshua and his global network of colleagues have helped people and teams in many industries leverage the wisdom and power of modern product development methods. He's been an early pioneer and practitioner of methods including extreme programming, lean software development, and the lean startup. He's crafted an approach called modern Agile to help people and organizations benefit from a principles-based approach to agility. So we'll get to explore that today, Agile versus agility. His most recent book of his many books is The Joy, or just Joy of Agility. So my mistake, sorry about that. Joshua, thank you for being here. How are you?
My pleasure. Thank you, Mark. A pleasure to be on your show. Yeah.
Well, so there's a lot to talk about, and I think we'll preface for listeners here, Agile or agility, we are not speaking, we think, only to people in software companies. Agreed?
Oh, very much so. Yes. Yes. Agility is an adjective, and it predates any kind of thing that happened in the software field.
So we'll have a chance to explore all those key differences here. So please keep listening if you are from other industries. We're going to be talking about ideas from manufacturing and applications into all sorts of other settings here. So, Joshua, as I often do here, I like to ask people their origin story. Sometimes it's easily framed as a quote unquote lean origin story. I'll let you take that whatever direction with whatever terminology fits for you.
I think my origin story would just be, I think I've always been interested in continuous improvement, long before I heard the term Kaizen.
Mm-hmm.
But it's always been in my nature to just look for improving things. And so that has applied to many things in my life, whether it's being a kid learning how to skateboard and trying to get better at it, or a craft like software development or writing, or, parenting, anything where there's a chance to improve. It's been part of my nature. So anything that's, in that vein is important to me. I love lean. I love all the principles and practices and the models and Agile. I love a lot of Agile. I don't like the Agile that most people hate, which is the cheesy, over commercialized certification factory kind of Agile. But real agility is something that I love, because you want your surgeon to be agile in the case of an unexpected situation. You want your lawyer to be agile. Agile is a good thing. We want to be agile. So yes, that's kind of my origin story.
Yeah, and not to play the what's the dictionary say game here, but I mean, how do you define Agile and agility? So, for example, I do a lot in work in healthcare. So, for a surgeon to be agile, what would be some characteristics or examples, or even from other industries, to be agile?
Yeah, I mean, so the definition is in the dictionary. It's I like the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of agile. Agile is an adjective, so it's gotta be associated with some noun. An agile team, an agile surgeon, an agile lawyer. Agile means characterized by a ready ability to move with quick, easy grace, or having a quick, resourceful, and adaptable character. Either one is really a good definition, and so you can apply that definition to pretty much anything. So I think in the book that you helped to put out there to edit, I think the book about Paul O'Neill on habitual excellence.
I have a copy. I don't mean to be ducking out of screen. But yeah, a playbook for habitual excellence.
A playbook for habitual excellence. In that book, I love the story about they found like 20 some odd different ways that was it something being drawing blood, or
I think it was probably the story related to managing central lines with Dr. Rick Shannon. 20 different ways for different people to do basically the same work.
Same work. So, and then, so that's not graceful. It might be quick and easy for someone to do it that way they learned, but if there's 20 different ways and it leads to mistakes, that there's no grace there. It's not graceful.
Right.
And so basically to me, lean might call it standard work, but that finding that way to do something with quick, easy grace is not easy at all.
Yeah.
Not easy. But it's wonderful. And my father had, open heart surgery back in last September. And obviously you want your surgeon to be incredibly nimble and agile in the space of the operating theater if things can go wrong.
Right.
It's a wonderful idea, and it mostly comes down to like how crafty are you, right? What's your craft? How deep of a practitioner are you, and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, thinking about surgery, and again, doing so as an engineer, you think of, they should have a method, they should have a plan, they should have standard work. That said, people in healthcare are fond of saying things like every patient is unique, and that may be true only to a certain extent. But what happens? What's the plan for when things don't go according to plan? How nimble, how agile, how adaptable are they to a situation where they discover something about the patient's condition that they didn't realize, or something is going wrong, whether it was caused by a mistake or not. They also need to, be agile. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So it's basically that ability to deal with the unexpected and to be able to just accomplish things very, very, quickly, easily, and gracefully.
Yeah. And it would be interesting. It's a thought experiment. If the phrase lean manufacturing had been, let's say, if they had dubbed it agile manufacturing, and sometimes people use that word agile in manufacturing, I think just as more of that adjective or that goal,
right?
Not meaning, software, but, when we talk about quick, easy grace, to me, that sounds like you're talking about not just speed, but quality, customer focus, I think is implied in that. But then the other part about resourceful and adaptable, that makes me think of kind of classic Toyota thinking of the cliche, putting creativity before capital. And Toyota had to be very resourceful because they couldn't throw money at problems back in the 50s, and then adaptable, to me, that sounds like Kaizen and continuous improvement. So it sounds like different words for maybe the same ideas.
I believe it's all in the same category of stuff. Like, there are people that in the lean community are like, oh no, I don't do that agile stuff. And there are agile people that basically don't know anything about lean, unfortunately. And I think ultimately all this stuff has a common denominator and is basically all focused on the same things. I'm reading a book right now on tennis, and it's basically talking about the scientific method of, probing and experimenting on out there on the tennis court when you're trying to figure out how to win in a match. And you've got to pay attention to your opponent, and you have to try things and experiment and probe, and it's like I could be reading a business book, but it's talking about tennis strategy.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like another scenario. I used to play tennis through high school, never at a high level, but I think you would come into a match with a game plan. Let's say if you know about your opponent. Like high school tennis, you're lined up against some random kid. You don't know their name even, barely. But it would seem like at the professional level, they've seen each other play, they've played each other, they could watch tape. They might say, "All right, I'm going to pick on you. Joshua's got a weak backhand, so that's my game plan. I'm going to try to hammer everything to his backhand." That might be known, and that might be, but then maybe you've worked on your backhand. Maybe that's no longer true, or maybe. I think, well, you're really a baseline player, and now you suddenly start playing serve and volley, and I wasn't prepared for that, right? So how do you adjust in the moment, right?
That's right. Yes. In fact, I was a couple of years ago, Chris Evert was announcing one of the female tennis matches, and she mentioned that player's agile, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. I'm going to send her my book. So I actually sent her a copy of Joy of Agility, and she enjoyed it. So
wow.
It's applicable. It's broadly applicable. These ideas.
Yeah, and was she wonder? Because you could be agile, you could be quick on your feet, or agile, quicken your thinking, or adjustments in match? Did she mean both in that context?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think anyone, at the height of tennis is aware of like the importance of thinking and the physical, the body. It's there's so much mind body stuff now too. I mean, and I mean these professional players, a lot of them have you know, thought coaches, mental coaches, whatever you want to call them, to help them, with the psychological. And I think just the other day I heard Chris Everett say it's so much a mental game, that people don't realize how much of a mental game. Djokovic is famous for saying, Novak Djokovic is famous for saying, everyone has good strokes and good this and that. It's the mind that's where the differences are.
Yeah, the physical talent and physical ability gap might not be as broad as that mental toughness.
That's right. Then that ability to problem solve.
Yeah.
Right. That ability to problem solve and find. So let's say you're not playing your A game. Great. What's your B game? What's your C game? How do you figure out this thing? So the great champions are able to do that. And it's not unlike what organizations need to do to solve their own problems. It's where we're constantly in the business of solving problems and breaking through. I say break on through to the agile side.
Right.
With apologies to the doors.
Sure. But I wanted to ask you, also, Joshua, for one, the name of your company, Industrial Logic.
Yes.
Like, what's the origin of that name?
Oh, yeah. Well, in the mid 1990s, a company was birthed that started doing some just incredible things, and it was very visual, and it was called Industrial Light and Magic.
Yeah.
George Lucas's company, and it's still around today. Back then, we were seeing, special effects in the movies that just were astonishing. You had never seen anything like it, and it was made by ILM, Industrial Light and Magic. I would love the name of the company. I just thought that is a cool name.
Yeah.
So when it came time to name my company, I wanted to play on that a little bit. So, and then logic's just always been a part of programming and stuff like that. So that's how that came together.
Yeah. So it's not because there were roots in doing software for manufacturing companies.
No, not really. It was really more like just I liked the Industrial Light and Magic name. So
yeah,
I also wanted a name that wouldn't be too coupled to any given method. It wasn't. Yeah, it was intended to be, a name that could last.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I'm a quote unquote industrial engineer. Is the name on my degree, and there are some who say like, "Oh, that sounds like a really dusty, outdated degree, like from horse and buggy days or something." But
I don't think so. I think it's cool. I
do too. I do too. But there's another word though. Maybe more importantly, that I hear people in healthcare kind of poo-poo. I've heard people in software kind of do the same, and that word is process. That you think of standardized work, or what's the plan? What's the process for the surgeon in their work? What's the process that supports them by providing the correct instruments that are properly sterilized and cleaned? And there's a lot of process. But in healthcare, I think people leap to thinking process means overly rigid. And it seems like I've heard people maybe with what I think, it's a perception. I would think it's not at all true that process means overly rigid. I mean, what do you run across? Do you run across people in software who are like, oh, no, process, that sounds bureaucratic or limiting or bad?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Process can be a bad word for a lot of people. Some would say don't focus on process, focus on outcomes. Some do think of process basically means I don't get to choose. I don't get to exercise my creativity because I have to follow the process. So it can lead to kind of like a way of being a automaton, some forms of mechanical kind of, I just follow. I think it's, I like to think about Coach John Wooden, right? The famous coach of, he was a Hall of Fame basketball player and a Hall of Fame coach, and considered one of the greatest coaches of the 20th century.
UCLA
Bruins, right? So he would say, he didn't. I don't think he used the word process at all. For sure, he didn't. But he focused on the mechanics of the Wooden style of playing, right? John Wooden's style of playing. And he'd say, I'm more of a practice coach than a game coach. I focus on practice and what we want to do. And when it comes to the game time, there's not much I can do. It's already going to happen. What's going to happen is going to happen at game time. Let's focus on that practice time. To me, they were practicing their process. And that process was to help their players be adaptive. As a whole, I mean, we can go on and on about what he taught them. I talk about it in the book a fair amount.
Yeah.
But it's to me, that's really what it's about: is being practiced in the ability to be agile, to be graceful under pressure, to be adaptive quickly when necessary. That kind of practice, that kind of process, is great.
Yeah. But back to that idea of process being helpful or being limiting. Like I think of the Toyota language I've heard. I think they've talked about what they call enabling bureaucracy or limiting bureaucracy. And I think there are a lot of settings where standardized work or process frees you to make decisions that are necessary in the course of your work. Having standardized work in healthcare certainly doesn't mean every minute of the day is scripted, like a repetitive 60-second job cycle might be on an assembly line. So, when people say like, well, we can't let the standard work, where it's going to tell people to check their brains at the door. I'm like, well, then let's not tell them that. Like that's our human choice. Or if they say, well, it Lean says we have to treat every patient exactly the same way. I'm like, well, Lean doesn't say anything. Like, come on, like let's use principles, but and let's not take it to an extreme. But do you run across other similar mindset or concerns when it comes to Agile or things that are more in the software and entrepreneurship space of like saying, well, this method says, as opposed to being able to think and discuss and decide as a team?
Yeah, you don't want it to be stifling. And so I think your terms of enabling, are really wonderful. I mean, it's you want people to feel enabled to potentially try something better, right? So break out of the process, try something better, right? Yeah. So permission to experiment.
Yes.
I think if people aren't experimenting, regularly, then you're not growing. So you ought to look at how often are we experimenting around here. Now, those have to be safe experiments, especially in a medical field, but in business as well, right? You be careful betting the entire company on an experiment. You want safe, productive experiments. So yeah, I think it's important to have an enabling. I probably wouldn't use the term for bureaucracy, but
right.
But again, in a large company that exists, and there's those things are there for good reason, right? Those policies and procedures, they're there to protect probably the company and the customers of the company, but they can become stifling. General Motors basically ended up having so many safety checks that it became stifling for them.
Right.
And they realized at some point that it was just not helping. They had to rethink it.
Right. Well, there's rules versus culture. So maybe let's bring the conversation back to Paul O'Neill, who you had mentioned earlier, and we're recording this on April 20th. It's 2 days past the third anniversary of his passing. So I've been thinking about Paul O'Neill a lot this week, as some of our colleagues have. Tell me, how did you get? I'm always curious. Like, how did you get exposed to him and to his ideas?
In 2012, I read Charles Duhigg's book, The Power of Habit, and there's a wonderful chapter in there called The Ballad of Paul O'Neill.
Yeah,
and I just basically went nuts for that chapter. I love the whole book, but that particular chapter, I had to read it again and started saying to myself, he transformed this 100-year-old industrial giant, which in the 1880s right? 1886 is when they started. They invented the aluminum smelting process
Yeah.
at Alcoa, and they were a monopoly. They were actually broken up later on in the 20s or 30s as a monopoly.
Hmm.
So that's what birthed Alcan in Canada, was a separate company. It used to be part of Alcoa.
Okay.
But at some point, decades later, they've lost their way badly. They would fight with the unions. They had poor quality. They were not innovating at all. Workers were unhappy. It was a mess. And Paul O'Neill was the first non-Alcoan to step into the CEO role.
That's right.
And he basically transformed the place with this singular focus on worker safety. So you know the story.
Yeah.
That's what blew my mind reading about that in Charles Duhigg's book. And I thought, well, we've been doing this with Agile, with extreme programming, for example. We've been really focusing on safety. We just haven't made safety like a first class word that we use a lot. Yeah. It's back there kind of hidden, the word safety. So I started to really see that what he was talking about really applied to what we do in software. And then I ended up reaching out to people at Alcoa and discovering some folks there who worked with Paul O'Neill, and eventually I ended up interviewing Paul O'Neill a couple of times. So that was just a huge career highlight for me.
But I'm putting you on the spot here. We talked about this before recording. You interviewed him, but you haven't published it. You're working on that, right?
Yeah, I interviewed him, and I didn't publish those interviews yet. We transcribed them, and I definitely have used little elements of what I learned in those interviews for sure. Right. There were things he told me about that had not been published in any books. And so they're in my book, Joy of Agility. Yeah. I just didn't publish the raw transcripts and all that stuff. Sure. But I do want to be getting that out there, breaking it up and giving the audio and all that stuff. So that's coming. Yeah. There's a lot of great gems in there.
Yeah, and I'll certainly help share that in different ways when you have that available. I mean, I had the opportunity. This is going back to episode 124 of this podcast series to interview him, and I'll put a link to that. Yeah, in the show notes. That was probably from about 10 years ago. But a lot of what he said, it's just really timeless. Because I mean, it's principles based. Yep. And I think that's what makes something a principle, is that there's a certain timeless element that you can point back to of, why are we making safety a priority? There's a number of principles there, and that went beyond, well, it's a really clever pathway to driving the stock price up. Well, no, I mean, that ended up happening. There's what he called, if you use that phrase with you or not, well, this comes back to the title of the book you mentioned, or we talked about, a playbook for habitual excellence. Like, his idea was doing the things that are required as leaders and around the culture and around problem solving and respect to really drive measurable safety incidents down. Those are the things that are also going to help you to produce better quality, better on-time delivery, lower cost. So as an end result, and and there was some influence from Toyota on Alcoa and Paul O'Neill. He came in with a certain set of principles, including nobody who works here should get hurt, and announcing that on his first day, and announcing it to the Wall Street analysts, which I think the Duhigg book talks about, of like how unusual that is. Oh yeah. Just like they went running out of the room to tell their customers to sell the stock, because you got a crazy man at the helm now talking about worker safety. Yeah, it was 1987, so I think people were running out to a bank of payphones is the visual. If right. Younger listeners can try to picture what that would have been. But I mean, so what does safety mean in software? Is it ergonomic keyboards and good chairs, or is there's got to be more to it than that too, right? Yeah, I mean, we talk about this safeties, like plural. There's all kinds of safeties, and it's not specific only just to software, right? We spend a lot of time on psychological safety. Yeah, and I know it's become a buzzword. We were interested in it long before it became a buzzword, and still are very actively helping our customers
understand what it means and practice it. So we have people that are absolutely, they love to teach this stuff. And so psychological safety is one. There's information safety, right? You don't want your information floating out there. There's obviously there's just normal security that we talk about in terms of, securing your software. There's some people think of job security or safety, right? Like, is my job safe? How can people feel that they're not, on the verge of losing work? I mean, I remember having a conversation with Paul O'Neill about this. Some of my questions were a bit, personal in terms of how I run my business. We had been struggling with, how do we market? We're not very good marketers. We're engineers, so
Yeah.
I was asking him some questions about stuff like that. And the topic came up of just like hiring. And, his view was that if you hire someone, you're hiring them for the long haul, otherwise they ought to be a contractor. It sounds very basic and obvious, and but it fit perfectly with my values, so that's what we've been doing for years. And it's like, but we've made our mistakes where we have hired someone that wasn't quite a fit, or we couldn't afford them. And so then it didn't work out. And it was like, in hindsight, I'd be like, well, probably didn't do enough planning there to make sure that this was the right fit, that we could afford it for a decade or more, whatever it is, a long haul. Some stuff like that. So I don't mean to get off the topic of your question, but there's,
No, it's fine.
to me, so many safeties,
Right.
So there's, obviously, financial safety. I think sometimes we build things that probably cost more, to build or to maintain than they actually cost in terms of revenue. So like, how can we be, cognizant of the costs?
Right.
A lot of engineers are shielded from the finances, almost like children, right? And I find that to be very sad, because I think if engineers know more about the costs of things, they can be better problem solvers. So, financial safety, it goes on and on.
Yeah. But something you said there, Joshua, reminds me of a point you made earlier. When you talk about the risk of mistakes, making an expensive capital investment or a big purchase decision that runs the risk of that being an expensive mistake. And it might be a mistake no one wants to admit because it was expensive, and we get into a bad cycle there. But tell us, your thoughts on the idea of how small experiments, small tests of change, safe experiments might minimize, if not eliminate, the risk of making that bigger, more expensive mistake.
Yeah, I mean, Lean Startup talks a lot about, capital efficient experimentation. And that's a fancy way of just saying quick, cheap experiments. We've done things where, for example, we've put up a fake feature. So basically, it looks like a feature in the software, but if you click on it, it says, oh, we haven't built this yet. How interested are you in this feature? Okay, now, if we did that all the time, our customers would hate us. They'd be afraid to click on anything. So that's one of many different testing techniques. You use it once in a while when you need it, but it's an example of not building the software up front, and instead doing a quick, cheap experiment online with real people in order to get more information rapidly and then make a decision, should we invest in this or not? That's an example, right? There's all kinds of other examples where you just do some paper prototypes and ask people to walk through some kind of a process to see, would this be a little more efficient for you? All you're using is pencil and paper, or other like online techniques that do the same type of thing. So there's whole books on like how to test business ideas. And I just think, again, that spirit of experimentation is so important.
Yeah, there's a difference between knowing that we have a solution to go implement because we know it's going to work, as opposed to this mindset of, we have an idea, let's go test it. And I think this is where people have misunderstandings about Lean Startup, and Eric Ries tries to correct people or proactively do so. It's not about being cheap. It's about faster, less expensive cycles of learning.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm paraphrasing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Directionally correct. So we can do the same thing with a process improvement in a hospital or in a workplace. Like, instead of knowing it's right and going and spending a lot of money, it takes a little bit of humility to go like, well, let's go test it, because maybe we might be wrong, or we might not fully understand it. Let's do a small test. Let's learn from it. And that requires a certain psychological safety to go try something and learn, instead of just being hell bent on proving your idea right. Failure is not an option kind of thinking.
Yeah, in the book, I talk about a story from Amazon where a summer intern came in and noticed, this is early days of Amazon, right? So it noticed that during checkout, there wasn't any kind of last minute offers. Like, hey, you could also buy this or buy that, right? Like, when you go to the grocery store, there's like magazines and candy and various things at the counter, right? When you're checking out. This would actually, his idea was this would be even cooler because we know what's in your cart digitally, right? We know, and so we could basically say, oh, you're buying these tennis shoes, you might be interested in this tennis racket or whatever. And so, but his idea was shot down by a senior VP.
Wow.
Just shot down. They said, listen, during the checkout process, we don't want to mess with anything. We just want it to go smoothly, and we don't want to interfere and get them.
They're saying no friction. Don't add friction to the buying experience.
That's right.
Yeah.
So he was shut down. However, Amazon had a kind of environment where you could test your ideas analytically, quantitatively. And so he just spun wrote some ugly code and just to see what would happen. And it was very promising. So promising that they said, well, let's actually now try it in a production environment on a tiny percentage of Amazon customers.
Yeah.
And that showed not only promise, it showed that they were losing so much money that if they didn't build this thing, they'd be foolish. Like, so they ended up creating a team and building it. And, that's an example, I guess, of a company that has invested in empowering people to experiment, even when folks don't agree.
Right. So that intern had a hypothesis, we could call it. Like, it sounded like a pretty reasonable idea. The senior VP may have had a hypothesis of like, well, we're going to see higher cart abandonment rates. And, when you have that battle of opinions, usually whoever's higher in the hierarchy wins. Where either one of them could have been wrong to some extent, but then having that ability, if not permission, to go do a small test of change. Let's see, okay, increased sales, cart abandonment rate, I don't know, like even if it was down a little bit, the abandonment rate was up, you might be net better off. And like that comes back to, psychological safety, as Tim Clark and others describe, is the best idea winning out as opposed to the highest ranking person. That's a sign that you have not just psychological safety, but good problem solving, good experimental business practices.
Right, exactly. I mean, and I'll just give a counter story, which is, we tried subscriptions on our e-learning software at some point. We have our own e-learning software, and we tried subscriptions, and we tried it. We really gave it a shot. It was a good year and a half of trying. And then we realized this is just not working, and it's not helpful, and let's get rid of the subscription concept altogether. And then fast forward several years later, new people join the company. Have you thought about subscriptions? And then that's where it's tricky, because it's like you don't want to be a know-it-all and like, no, we're not doing subscriptions. Sorry, great idea, we're not doing it.
We tried that before and it didn't work.
We tried that before and it didn't. We tried that before it did, but we did try it before and it didn't work. And we don't have a lot of economic runway to burn again trying that same experiment. And it wouldn't be largely different than what we had already tried. So that's a case where it's like, I don't even need a quantitative experimentation and environment, because we've already done all that work and it did show us that it didn't work. So I mean, there's times when I think you have to, find the right balance there between,
Well, I mean, balance is hard to find. So let's say evaluating an experiment, or is it not working, or is it not working yet? I mean, there's a lot of gray area. And so we had a hypothesis that this would be better. Doesn't seem to be better. So is our hypothesis that people are coming up a learning curve? We're going through a productivity dip, but it's going to get better. So let's persevere. Let's stick with it. Versus, back to the lean startup language, I guess. Do we pivot? Do we give up? Like what's the A and the plan? I like plan, do, study, adjust. Like is it adopt, adapt, abandon? There's lots of different A's you could throw in there. There's so much art and gray area to that, and I don't know, without psychological safety and the ability to try things and be wrong, like it just seems like there are too many traps where I'm going to be super cautious and not try new things, or I'm going to give up too quickly, or it's like that all seems really suboptimal to the business if I have to always be right.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Yeah. I mean, I think, I've had kids, and so like, you want them to, when they're learning to walk, you want them to fall, you want them to try things on their own, but you're not going to let them do it by a staircase. Right. Yeah. So there's that.
Yeah.
Where does it get to be actively dangerous?
Right.
To do that experiment versus, yeah.
I hope nobody has ever filmed a TikTok video of baby's first steps on the edge of the Grand Canyon. No.
Yeah. So, it's so in the book, I just want to mention that since I'm a huge fan of Paul O'Neill, and I know he was really, really into this dignity and respect for people,
yes.
Right? That he'd say if you didn't have dignity and respect for people, one of his three major questions that he asks for habitual excellence is, are people treated with dignity and respect every day without regard to their race or educational background or this and that and the other thing?
Right.
And it was an hugely important part of his thinking. So much so that in my book, it nearly became one of the mantras. There's 6 mantras in the book. And one of them used to be something like, treat people with dignity and respect.
Mm-hmm.
Slowly but surely that morphed and changed. It goes back to that definition of being quick, easy, and graceful.
Mm-hmm.
So what I realized at a certain point was that if you're graceful, that means you're graceful with people too.
Yes.
And, it's not always possible to be graceful if you're not in balance. So imbalances,
Mm-hmm.
being unstable, coming to work and being, off center. These are things that lead to the opposite of dignity and respect for people. People can feel disrespected or whatever because you're not balanced, or there's not a balance of like experiments and standard work,
mm-hmm.
right? So balance became this word for me that became so utterly important. I hadn't realized the importance of balance to agility or to high performance. How important that word is, and how much Paul O'Neill fixated it on it for his players. Offensive balance, defensive balance, player size balance.
Are you talking about John Wooden?
John Wooden. Sorry, yes, John Wooden. John Wooden would get, he was obsessed with balance, and he'd say the only reason I'm obsessed with balance is because balance is a prerequisite for speed.
Yeah,
you cannot be fast if you're not in balance. And so, be balanced and graceful became the mantra.
Yeah,
and that is, to me, echoing what O'Neill would talk about when it came to treating people with dignity and respect. You've got to find the right balance. You've got to be graceful, and then the right things tend to happen. Right.
Because I mean, it's an outcome from principles, and having, when people talk about culture, it's this question of like, if it's a global company and you go and talk to people at different sites around the world, like how consistently do they talk about certain things? Or there's certain stories that tend to pop up over and over again. It's a good sign of like, and I've run across a lot of former Alcoa people, and it's very consistent of stories they have of their interactions with Paul O'Neill, or interactions that they witnessed or observed, of like being as respectful to the person working at the front desk as you would to an executive. That respect is, I think from his standpoint, something that you granted, as opposed to, I think there's a darker view when people are like, oh, respect needs to be earned. Okay, well, that sounds like you judge who's worthy of respect, and that, to me, I wouldn't subscribe to that leadership model, as opposed to, Paul O'Neill's idea of respecting everybody. Now, there's stories, and I'm sure as he told you and are documented in these different books, he would challenge people, right? Respect doesn't mean being nice or soft. or easy. I mean, this might have been one of the original big, hairy, audacious goals of zero harm.
Right.
Right. So you got to push people. You got to challenge. You got to hold plant managers to standard. And Paul O'Neill famously gave out his phone number
Yes.
to frontline employees that if your safety issues are not getting resolved immediately, here's my home phone number.
Yep.
And I'm sure that first time he got that call, I don't know the details of it, but I'm sure that plant manager wasn't happy with the phone call he got.
Right.
Right. But it's not because Paul O'Neill, I don't think, loved if he yelled. There's some leaders who love yelling at people because it's an expression of power. But I think Paul O'Neill was trying to use his power to help the vulnerable people who didn't have any power. I mean, I don't know, maybe that's
it was an absolutely remarkable thing to give his home number. And the story of that worker calling him late at night in Connecticut, it's in my book. Because it's such an utterly remarkable story of how that all was handled.
Yeah.
And I mean, back to the whole respect thing. I'll just never forget the story from Zappos, which is when they interview people, they'll put them through interviews all day long, and then they'll put them on this little bus to take them back to their hotel. And this is their bus. It's a Zappos bus or van, whatever the heck it is, right?
Yeah.
And then you've probably heard this, but the person driving the van or shuttle, whatever, will then come back to the office after dropping them off, and they'll interview that person, say, well, how did they treat you? Yeah. Right. So again, back to like, how do you treat everyone, whatever their rank is, with dignity and respect? I mean, the things that Paul O'Neill did to remove special privileges for executives. Executives used to fly to New York City, stay in an apartment owned by Alcoa, take their families to Broadway plays and stuff, all on the company's dime. And he just completely eliminated this. Right. He got rid of the golf course for the executives. The cafeteria that was only for executives, this is going away.
Yeah.
Some would say, wow, he was a complete maverick.
Yes. And there's different dimensions to this. So there's big expenses and there's the little ones. So the one story that I've heard him tell was that, every morning the executives got like a free Wall Street Journal and free coffee and Danish. And he would ask, well, do we give that to everybody?
Right.
And the answer, of course, was no. And he's like, I think our executives can afford those things.
Right.
We're paying them well. And then like with the golf course, I've heard how there was not just the expense, but like on day one in that job, he realized that golf club had very discriminatory, exclusionary membership policies.
Right.
And so back to principles, he was like, we are not going to pay for that. And my recollection of it is that he came to the club and said, I think it was, you're going to admit a black member, and here's the Alcoa executive who I suggest is the first member. So there was some, if you will, social activism, but back to the principles of what message does that send to your employees if word gets out that the company is paying for a golf club that discriminates?
Yeah. I mean, just incredible stuff. I interviewed a guy named William O'Rourke. So
I know. Yeah.
Yeah, an amazing guy, and his stories are. He worked directly with Paul O'Neill for years. He worked, he's also an incredible leader and an amazing person there. And the stories he told about dealing with what he dealt with in Russia, where basically they're trying to they took over these smelting aluminum plants there,
formerly state run.
Formerly state run, where the average of 5 people would die every year. And they completely transformed it. But he had to deal with the pressure of having a whole bunch of equipment sent to Russia and sitting there in the warehouses not moving because they wanted him to pay bribes.
Yep.
And he wouldn't repay bribes. So the incredible integrity, right? Another part of O'Neill's approach is just extremely high integrity.
Right.
This is a part of the Agile movement that I can't stand, is I think there's a lot of integrity issues when it comes to like these cheap little certifications that were put out there many years ago, and are not at all, associated with quality or excellence or anything. Just
that's a problem in Lean Six Sigma circles, just the same.
Yes.
Or it can be. So there are so many parallels. It's funny. I mean, we're in a lot of ways talking about different industries, different settings, but a lot of it comes back to these very familiar themes and principles. And I think that's what's powerful. Is the ability to learn and transform ideas. Paul O'Neill helped people in healthcare. You alluded to this earlier, that these principles are applicable as opposed to the trap of copying tools.
Right.
And is this so? There's a word, a phrase I've heard related to Agile, and I think it applies in other settings, but I want to ask you to explain it. What is meant by cargo cult Agile?
Yeah, I mean, it's just obviously it's just following some formula or recipe that you think that worked for elsewhere, and you copy it and try to apply it, and it usually doesn't work. It's often just superficial or rearranging the seats on the Titanic.
Right.
It's not at all addressing the underlying issues and stuff like that. So it's unfortunate, but it does happen, I think, everywhere. And I've read, and in my book, I quote one of the leaders in the lean field who said that he's disappointed in where lean has gone because to a large extent, people are doing little changes, always little changes, and never lean leaps. And I think it's James Womack who said this, basically criticizing the lean movement and just saying we missed it. At some point, we lost this ability to do these leaps. The Japanese railway system that led to the bullet trains. Another thing Charles Duhigg wrote about, right? That was an incredible leap in how we think about railway, speed. Huge leap. And so a lot of people talk about small changes, and they're great. Small changes are great, but also maybe how do you get bigger changes to happen too?
Well, there's that piece, and it's and we can do small changes and we can do bigger revolutionary changes, maybe built on small tests of change. But I think there's this other trap of not just certification or thinking a misframed problem statement, or executive thinks, well, the problem is the workers, so the workers need training so that they can be more lean, quote unquote, or they can be more agile, or they can be safe. I'm like, well, wait a minute. Like, I think a lot of it starts with the people. If you were to look in the mirror, and that's harder to get people to accept. I think there's some human nature. Unless people are mavericks, they're going to want to blame others instead of look and say, what's my role in creating this, and what do I need to do to change the culture, whether that's a culture of safety or a culture of agility or both.
That's right. So it comes down to like is your nature one of Kaizen, continuous improvement, or not? And I think if it's not there, it's going to be a problem for the organization. And
I mean, I think these things can be taught. I mean, that we could have a separate nature versus nurture discussion, but I think the issue then is when an executive has decades. I mean, this goes back to a Demingism. I think it was something like decades of experience means nothing if it's decades doing the same thing over and over, the same wrong thing over and over. I'm paraphrasing.
Right. That's right. Yep.
It's harder to change the more set you are in mindsets and behaviors, and you've succeeded, maybe even in spite of some of those, but it feels like you've succeeded because of those.
Right. Yeah. It's easy to have blind spots too. So like this is where diversity is so important, right? Having diverse perspectives around you, having the humility to be wrong and listen to others. There's just so many ways that we can improve and just caring to improve, like healthcare. I mean, my gosh, it's like, imagine how the world could be different if we were better at healthcare. I mean, in addition to like, helping people not even ever have to go to the doctor because we're doing the work necessary to keep them healthy in the first place.
Yeah. Well, gosh. Okay. So we're almost up on a time limit here. So I want to start to wrap up. And again, Joshua Kerievsky, Joy of Agility is the book. I mean, this is great fun. Maybe when we have you back at some point, there's so much we could explore. And I mean, as a final point real quick, within the book of the mantras, one of them that stood out is very Deming-esque. It's very O'Neillian. Drive out fear, make safety a prerequisite to protect people and pave the way for high performance. Maybe I'll just leave it to you, for kind of a final thought on that mantra.
Yeah, that's a complete hat tip to Deming and O'Neill. Driving out fear being our such an important part of our job, right? Whether that's psychological safety, the fear of speaking up, we have to prevent it. The fear of experimenting, we have to drive out fear in an economy that's kind of slow. How do we help drive out fear there? What do we do? How do we behave in such a way? How do we make products or provide services that drive out fear so that people aren't afraid of using those products or services. They feel confident in them. This is the secret. This is a major secret to success, is driving out fear. So I bow down to those folks, and like to just, my stories are in the book are very much paying homage to all these great thinkers. It's just, I wanted one place to go to have a bunch of these stories that even young people could and experienced people could go to say, yeah, this is really what they were talking about.
Yeah. And I had flipped real quick. I had magically found the O'Neill page. But shoot, yeah, I see that it's in there. But lots of short chapters and a lot of great ideas in here. So I hope people will check it out. Joy of Agility, Joshua Kerievsky. Thank you so much for being a guest. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Mark. I loved chatting with you, and anytime.
All right. Thanks.